You can now support the show through Patreon or by purchasing the new Will I Vike It and Saxon Forager merch. There's some really great designs, some of which were done by the fantastic Saxon storyteller. If you can't spare the money but still want to show your support, click the subscribe button. It really does help. Enjoy the episode, and I hope you Vike it. Hello and welcome back to the Will I Vike It podcast. Today my guest is Lars Marius Garshol. Apologies if I've butchered your name.
No,
Welcome
you did
to
not.
the show.
Thank you.
And so your sort of what you do is a lot of research into the history of brewing, right? So sort of more farmhouse beers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's I'm really into what's called farmhouse beer, but when you get further back into history, that's the only kind of beer there was. So in that sense, I'm researching farmhouse brewing all the way back to the beginning.
So how far back have you gone?
Well, the oldest find of beer that's known is from 11,000 BC. So it's quite far back, yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite
Yes.
remarkable because this find is from before people started growing grain.
Okay.
So these people were not farmers and they were not trading the grain. They were just harvesting wild grain and brewing beer from that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite a striking find.
I mean, how did you sort of get started with your research? Because I gather from your website that it started off as I guess more of a hobby that's become currently what you do for a living, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Although the research itself doesn't pay very much. I started, just being interested in beer, like a lot of people are. This is like a little bit over 20 years ago, and then got more and more interested. Started traveling the world, trying different types of beer, learning more about them. And it was really when I discovered that farmhouse brewing existed, the things started getting more serious for me, because this tradition of the farmers brewing for their own use, everyone knew that this had once existed, but I was just discovering that it seemed to exist all over the Nordic countries, basically. And these beers were brewed in completely different ways, and nobody seemed to know about it. And that's when I really started doing serious research.
So what was it that made you sort of take the leap and go from, I don't know, what did you do for a living before?
I was a software engineer.
Oh, so quite a change.
It was quite a change, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What made you take that leap?
It was basically that as I got more and more into this research, I mean, I started doing quite a lot, like 1 week of ethnographic expedition every year, going to archives and collecting their documents, plus a lot of reading and doing interviews with people. And I was just amassing so much material that was new to everyone. I felt I can't just sit on this. I have to get it out into the world. So essentially that was the reason.
Nice. Yeah. Do you enjoy that? Is it better than software engineering?
It is better in a lot of ways. I'm much more in control of my own time, and it feels a bit more like I'm doing something important, which perhaps I wasn't before. But it was really this overwhelming itch that I had to deal with. It wasn't. In some way, you could almost say it wasn't a choice. My inclinations forced me to do it.
It's like your destiny.
In a way, I guess.
Yeah. If you're sort of that way minded, then yeah.
Well, I mean, it certainly is destiny in the sense that it's something that you didn't deliberately set out to do. Just circumstances force you to do it.
Yeah.
So
I know that
absolutely.
feeling.
Yeah.
My background is as a historical reenactor, but actually I'm a painter and decorator.
Right.
And that's still my day job at the moment. But the reenactments led for sort of more towards recipes and writing cookbooks, teaching people to cook more from the Saxon and the Viking period. So kind of a similar path, really. It's
yeah.
a hobby that's,
Although I guess your past experience might be more relevant to you, right? It's useful for reenactment, I suppose. Make it look nice and appealing and so on. Your background as a painter and decorator.
We don't tend to work with paints too much with the reenactment stuff. Yeah. My wife does some painting, but that's more like manuscript work.
Oh.
Writing, that kind of thing. So yeah, she's more into that, but because I do it for a living, I kind of go more down the food route and the brewing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, dealing with or reenacting brewing from, way back in the past, that's not, well, depending how you see it, that's not easy because there's so little evidence, or it's very easy because you can do anything you want and there's no evidence.
Yeah. It could go either way, really. It's I mean, the food's the same, isn't it? We don't have an awful lot of evidence. We know what the ingredients were, we know what equipment they had. How that was put together on a day-to-day basis is kind of the best guess.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and like you say, with brewing, if you're doing it from household to household or farm to farm, it's going to vary quite a bit, I would imagine.
It certainly did, like 100 years ago. Brewing in Norway, for example, types of malt that they used, brewing processes, even the herbs, the type of grain, mind-boggling variation, really. With some things that were common pretty much everywhere, but on top of that, huge variation.
So when you've done your research into the more historical beers, has there been anything that you found really surprising, like any big difference between modern brewing and the historical, or is it very much the same?
Well, I mean, even the farmhouse brewing that exists now, that people do, today, is very, very different from commercial brewing. And it's those interests or differences that sort of drew me into this in the first place, because if it was the same beer, it wouldn't really be very interesting. But it turns out a lot of them are brewing in ways that the textbooks say you can't do.
Right.
So, of course, for me, that was super interesting. So you get like a whole bunch of different questions at the same time. Like, so what does it taste like? How does it work? I mean, what's wrong with the textbook when it says you can't do it and clearly you can? And how did they come to do this in the first place? And it's just this curiosity really drew me into it.
So have you done much research into sort of recreating some of the recipes or the things you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, for the stuff that's happening now, you can just go visit the brewer and brew with them and see what they do and to try the result. But a traditional farmhouse brewer will typically make 150 liters each time. And I live in a normal house. I can't make 150 liters. It's just impossible. So that means you have to try and translate their recipe to different equipment, and it's much harder than it seems. Even though you've seen the whole thing done, you know biochemically how it works, it's still hard to get it right.
And I think
part of the problem is that historically, now if you buy brewing ingredients, they are standardized, and you know exactly how much sugar you will get out of this type of malt, how much bitterness there is in these hops. But when people were producing their own ingredients, this wasn't the case, and they also had no thermometers. So there are no recipes, and there are no standardized approaches, if I can put it that way. So that makes it much harder to sort of take what they are doing and translate it to a different context. So some people say things like, well, you've hit the right temperature when the kettle starts singing. It's emitting a specific tone. Well, I mean, I'm using a kettle that's like 1/10 the size, even less than that, and it's not suspended over a wooden fire. it's not going to sing.
Mm.
So yeah, things like that.
So then going back sort of to sort of my period that I'm doing with the
Mm-hmm.
Vikings and the Saxons, I know a lot of people are sort of against the idea that they would have used hops in beer.
Oh, well, that one's easy to answer. We have lots and lots of hop finds from the Viking period, from the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, even Russia. There's even an archaeological find where they found a bronze ladle in a grave with hop seeds in it. So they think there was a drink flavored with hops in this ladle. Unfortunately, it was contaminated before it was excavated, so they don't really know what type of liquid, what type of drink it was. But it seems to have been made with hops. There's also mention of hops in the Viking laws, for example, regulations on hop growing. So it seems very clear that they were using hops. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that a millennium later, not all of the brewers in the same area were using hops. Most of them, but not all.
So it goes back out of fashion again.
Well, I think maybe it never broke through completely. I think it's been yes, there were people in the Viking Age using hops in the beer, but I don't think they were all doing it. Maybe it was a minority. We don't know. But it seems that maybe it spread sort of gradually, and even in the present day, it still hasn't taken over completely, basically. That's my guess.
Yeah. We've got the big, was it Graveny?
Yes.
Down by London, where they've got the ship full of hops, or they think was carrying hops at the time.
It seems really likely that somebody was trading hops in that ship. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. But I wonder whether they were doing it for the beer, or one thing that a lot of people don't realize is you can eat the hops.
Well, this wasn't hop shoots that they found. It was really the cones. Okay. So I think there is good reason to think that it really was used in beer. And there is a second find from York, where they found hop cones and also grain, and the reasonable interpretation seems to be probably brewing. I mean, it's not certain, but it seems more likely.
Yeah.
But it's true the hops were used for other things. So they think it was used for making ropes, possibly for dyeing cloth. And it's true, you can eat the shoots as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got some growing literally just outside the building here. Right. I did try to pick some before we started, but they're just coming up at the moment.
They're coming up?
Yeah, just about.
Where are you living?
I mean, in Wiltshire, the middle of England.
Okay. We have 40 centimeters of snow, and it's like nothing is growing. Absolutely nothing except the icicles.
I don't know. It's not quite that cold. I'm just having a look what the temperature would be at the moment. We're at 7 degrees today.
Okay, it was -6 this morning.
Bit of a difference.
Yes.
Yeah, we've had some colder weather lately, but it's warmed up enough that, as I say, the hops are just coming up. And I tend to use them a bit like asparagus. They're like a cut and come again. And the more you pick them, the more vigorously they grow.
Oh.
But you still get your hops at the end as well. So you kind of got the double benefit of you've got an early crop when there's not much else growing.
Yeah, because I guess these shoots are only interesting if you want the plant to expand. And once it's sort of grown to the right size, you probably don't want it taking over the garden.
They grow very vigorously.
Yeah, that's what everyone says.
Yeah, I can't remember what the full length of an established plant is, but it's a fair few meters.
Yeah. But they're even hard to get rid of. I read in an archive document where a Danish woman said that her grandfather pulled up the hops 50 years ago, but they were still coming out of the ground in the same place. They still hadn't gotten rid of them.
Wow.
But it's the roots, right? That really are the plant. And the stuff that comes up every year is just what it uses to mate with other plants, really. So
Yeah,
most of
yeah.
the real plant and the stuff that lives from year to year is underground. So then you try and pull it up, but if you don't get everything, it'll just keep coming out of the ground.
I think they're quite deep rooted as well because you don't have to
Yes.
water them in the summer or anything like that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and we find they're really good, sort of environmentally. They're great because insects love them. They're full of things like ladybird
Right.
larvae,
Right.
and so and then that attracts the birds, and it's a
Right.
great thing to plant even if you're not growing beer.
I actually tried to plant. I wanted we had a tree next to the house, and I wanted to have the hops climbing the tree because they're really
Mm.
parasites on trees. And I thought that would be kind of try and keep this tree under control a bit as well. But when I planted it, it didn't grow. It didn't work. So I need to try again. I had the shoot that I was using was too small, basically.
I've
But
planted a few, but I find the ones I've done under trees in the fashion you've said, thinking they grow up, are the ones that
yeah.
don't do as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they're competing
Um,
with the tree, I guess.
yeah, and if you've already got an established tree with the roots, I guess there's not enough
Yeah.
room for them to spread out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay. Then I learned that. Thank you.
We're all learning. That's part of life, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, that's the fun. Yes.
and it's yeah, there's so many sort of little trails and ways you can go with expanding your knowledge that it's
Yep.
really difficult to do. I mean, I've only really dabbled a little bit with brewing with my Viking age cooking, and it tends
Right.
to be more things like meads. Um, and I've used more modern techniques to make beers that maybe would taste more historic, but I
Hmm.
tend to use things like malt extract, which obviously is not how they would have done it historically, but it gives you an idea of the
No.
flavors when you're
Well, I
putting things
mean,
like juniper.
to really do it correctly, I mean, you need to start even not even from malt, but from grain,
Mm,
because they were all making their own malts as well, and that had a huge impact on the flavor. But
yeah,
but that's really quite a lot to ask. Making malts takes a lot of time and a lot of space.
yeah,
So, but there are people who still make their own malts, and their beers are nothing like what anyone else makes.
mm,
That's really makes a huge difference.
yeah. A lot more level of control.
Yeah, and it's
Mm,
also well, I guess in a sense, it's the commercial malt producers have obviously super control over what they're doing.
mm,
Um, but when you make your own malts, you don't really have the same degree of control. And what it means is if you know when you're making a modern beer, you pick several types of malts and you sort of compose them together to get the right flavor. If you use
mm,
only one type of malt, it becomes very boring. But when you make your own malts, because the process is not so controlled, the grain at the outer edge, say when you're germinating it, will be
mm,
colder than the grain in the center. And there will be all these little minute differences throughout the batch that you're making. So you don't get this single note problem. You get actually much more complex flavors from just a single type of malts. But the whole thing just winds up being very, very different.
mm. And I guess it would vary year to year because I know with other things, even like honey, the flavors will
Yes.
vary based on what the bees are foraging, and obviously your plants and crops are going to produce slightly different product every year. So I guess you
Yeah.
probably would never get the same beer twice almost.
No, 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 you wouldn't. So people have been very clear that in a year with the optimal weather, you get far better beer than in a bad year. This is stuff that the modern industry evens out from year to year and sort of they hide these fluctuations. But to a
Mm,
farmer who only had his own grain, this was very clear. So this even stories where the key plot point is that the weather that summer was so great and that was why the beer was so good and so on. So yeah, absolutely.
mm. Yeah, I've heard a similar thing. I had a cider maker on recently, and he was saying
Yeah,
about how we had such dry weather last year, and so it was a really good year because the apples produce more sugar, so you end up with
yeah,
higher alcohol content, and yeah, it all has that knock-on effect.
yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. And it would be the same with the hops. They wouldn't be the same from year to year either. So that's one major reason why when they were brewing, they were doing most of it by tasting to see how, you know, a modern brewer would calculate beforehand how much sugar they expected to get, and then they would measure it and see if they got it right. But the old time brewer would be doing this by taste instead, and some people still do it that way.
So you'd need that experience of past years of what worked, what didn't work, so that you can adapt it.
But that's one benefit that these brewers have over a modern brewer. So a modern brewer will you know, compose a recipe, brew that, then come up with another one, then brew that. But the traditional brewer makes only one beer, and they make it over and over and over and over again for, you know, decades.
Yeah.
And that, of course, helps them really hone in on and of course, when they started brewing, they didn't start from scratch because their grandpa or their father was brewing the same thing. So they were picking up all of that accumulated experience as well.
Yeah.
So seeing these guys brew is quite interesting. They really know what they're doing. And then, but anytime you try and ask them, why are you doing this? Well, ultimately because Grandpa did. They don't know why they're doing any of the things that they're doing, but it works.
So why stop?
No, they're not stopping, but it's really it's made it very hard for people coming from the modern way of doing things to sort of understand and appreciate what it is they're doing, because the whole your entire way of thinking about what you're doing is so different. And then their beer on top of that tastes really strange and different as well. So it's for people coming from modern beer, it's been quite a hurdle to get over.
So in the Viking Age, how much did the equipment vary based on sort of modern equipment? Was it a particularly different process?
It was very different. Of course, it depends what you're comparing with, right? If you're comparing with a modern brewer, then it's like they are from a different planet. Whereas if you compare with a modern farmhouse brewer, it's more similar, but still very different. So all of the brewing equipment was made of wood. A lot of it looked like basically like a barrel where you sawed off the top. So that's the sort of vessel that you are working in. And some people had a metal kettle that they were brewing in.
Yeah.
But most people couldn't afford that. They were really, really expensive. So if you've ever done brewing from grain, the key step in the process you absolutely must do if there's going to be any beer is you have to heat the malt and water mix to 65 degrees or more. Now, how are you going to do that if you don't have a kettle? That's quite that is actually quite difficult. So what they did was they would make a fire and put rocks about, you know, this size in the fire, and then have a wooden vessel with water and malts in it, and then drop hot stones into it to heat it up to the right temperature and extract the sugar from the malt. So and that of course creates a completely different flavor from what you get from a modern process. And then the second thing that you do in modern brewing is you boil for an hour. And doing that with hot stones is really, really awkward. And there's also no point. There's no reason to do it. So they didn't do that. In fact, if you look at modern farmhouse brewing, half of the brewers today in 2023 still don't boil. So that's another thing that really made these beers, you know, these historic beers, very, very different from what we're making now. But it's clear that some people did brew with kettles, but they must have been only the richest, basically.
Yeah, to have the funds to get a metal pot. Or
Yeah,
yeah,
there's
which,
documentation from 1350, for example, that the price of a brewing kettle was roughly 2.5 cows.
mm,
For an ordinary farmer, that's like, no, not going to happen.
yeah.
And on Norwegian farms, you can imagine if they were brewing beer for a very, very long time, using
Mm,
these stones every time, and they shatter in the heat, and they also shatter when they're really hot and you drop them in cold water, they fracture. It
yeah.
sounds like a pistol shot, actually. It's quite
Mm,
dramatic. Of course, these stones accumulate, right? So on a typical Norwegian farm, when you start digging and you find these layers of shattered rock,
mm.
it's like 1,500 cubic meters in some cases. Like you need what? 800 garbage containers to remove them.
Wow.
But it's literally a millennium of hot rock brewing.
Mm. That's something I've not tried actually, is brewing with hot rocks. Maybe that's a future experiment.
It really looks interesting, and it's
Mm,
extremely photogenic. So it's a real crowd pleaser, but you have to be careful about what stones you use. Sometimes types of stones will explode while you're heating them, and
mm,
shoot little fragments of stone everywhere. So you want something that's mostly homogeneous, because it's when it heats up. If the different parts of the stone have different composition, one part will expand more than another, and bang. So sandstone, for example, is very good. Granite is also good.
it could be
So
quite a
that's
dangerous experiment, really. With,
well, I mean, what you can do is, is you find some stones and you think, okay, these will probably work.
mm,
Make a fire, put them in the fire, and just leave it alone. Stay away.
mm.
And if they don't explode, then okay, this worked. You can use them.
I've done a little bit with cooking in sort of pits and things where you chuck your
Right.
rocks in.
Yeah.
Um, Similar kind of idea, but then they're being buried. So if they do crack, they're underground.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively safe thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in the archaeological record. What the archaeologists refer to as brewing stone layers end roughly 1600, and they start in the middle of the 6th century, roughly. But
Mm.
then there are different heat shattered stones that are older, that appear in basically in circular sort of pits. And they have been assuming that those are remains of exactly the type of cooking that you're talking about. Um, but we also think that people brewed in Norway for 4,500 years by the time that the proper brewing stone layers start. So to me, it seems like I don't think the archaeologists have finished explaining this, basically.
Mm.
There's been several attempts. I read a few papers where they tried to look for example, remains of fat or meat protein in these layers, and they didn't find them. And then there's another paper where they analyzed these layers and they found a lot of phosphorus. Well, that's a typical signature of grain. But
Mm.
so this is my theory that it was used for beer brewing, but I don't think there's any archaeologist who would say, yeah, absolutely. That's not. Perhaps it could be proven, but it's just a theory at
Yeah,
this point.
yeah. I mean, it's constantly evolving, isn't it? As
Yeah.
more things are found, opinions change all the time.
Yes. I was doing this book, and I did this diagram over time of what cooking technologies did they have at different times in Norway.
Mm.
And it was really quite hard just to find out, when did they have ceramics and when didn't they? When did they have soapstone kettles? When didn't they? How big is a soapstone kettle? All this stuff.
Mm.
But then when I drew it, it was like, oh, but this can't be right. The layer of brewing stones and what we think we know about when they brewed is like, this doesn't fit at all. it has to be resolved somehow, but the answer doesn't
Yeah.
have to be that those pits with stones were from brewing, because there's other possible answers as well.
Mm.
So, but it's going to take years to find out, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's constantly evolving, and as new people come into it as well, they've got new ideas like yourself.
Yeah.
And that kind of feeds a little bit back into the research itself, doesn't it? Because then people, there's a good example. I've got a friend that thinks, the little spiral iron things that people cook little flatbreads on. I don't know what they're called, to be honest.
Oh, the small ones, like a
They're
great,
only
like a. Oh, okay.
and people often think they cook bread on them. But actually, I know someone that thinks that what they might have done is used that for the heating process in a brewing,
Oh,
rather than your hot rocks, because you'd heat the rod up and put the
right.
rod in, and then you could also use it to
Okay.
stir. Yeah.
There is evidence from 19th and 20th century of people using metal in exactly that way. But the the difficulty with that explanation back in time is that metal was so expensive for anything. So people used to believe. Now I'm talking farmers in the 19th century.
Yeah.
They used to ascribe all sorts of magical properties to metal. So if you wanted to, they were really worried about their beer being attacked by supernatural forces.
Right.
The real reason is that beer easily goes bad, right? And you don't know why. So they were blaming supernatural creatures. And one thing that you would do is you would take a knife and you would stick it in the fermenter. Or you would take an axe and lay it on top of the fermenter. But it was really metal that was protecting the brew. And you know this custom of hanging horseshoes over doors?
Yeah, I've got one on my house, actually.
Yeah. There's nothing to do with it being a horseshoe. It's just that it's metal. So the metal is then protecting the entrance to the house. And if you look at old Norwegian buildings, you have the lock, and usually there's two metal bands that connect to the hinges, and they hold the wooden planks together. Those get turned into really elaborate shapes, both coming from the lock and from these bars. And again, these are magical. People believe that these were protecting the door. But if you look at the rest of the house, there's absolutely no metal anywhere, no nails, because they couldn't afford nails.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, this is one of the things that when I started looking into the background and the tradition of brewing, that really just stunned me. Like, you see how completely different the past was from our own time. So it's one of the really striking differences.
And it's one of the things we see in reenactment as well, is that everybody's got their cast iron cooking pot, and everyone uses raised fireboxes that are like the one on the Bayer tapestry, which is obviously to protect the ground. That's a more modern thing, but
Yes.
there is a lot of ironwork that goes around on campsites. I'm guilty of it myself.
Right. If you look at a Norwegian farm, 1800, the fireplace is just stone. Like the cooking surface for bread, that's stone for the most part. Yeah, even the pots, Viking age pots of typical 5 to 10 liter size, most would be stone as well. Soapstone. So, and probably soapstone was expensive too, because someone has to, literally hack it out of the rock and transport it to you.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the modern stuff, I've got, pots are quite expensive to get now when you get these replicas.
Oh, that's nice though.
But sort of from a modern perspective, it's almost flipped, because the pottery can be more expensive than the metalwork, and so a lot of people end up with these cauldrons and things.
But the pottery is another interesting thing, because in Norway, Norwegian production of ceramics ends completely, roughly in the middle of the 6th century. It just stops. So like from the Middle Ages, there's almost no pottery that's been found, and it's all in the towns and it's all imported. So your normal person wouldn't even have pottery. But again, if you look at, I really recommend going to one of the Norwegian open air museums and looking at both the buildings and the technology that they used. It was all based on wood. Everything was wood. And of course, wood was free, right? You just had to chop it down and carve it into what you wanted.
Yeah, yeah. And even if you're not particularly good at carving, I'm sure you can make a bowl or something that's usable.
Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of people seem to have been very, very skilled at this. So if you look at like a beer bowl, the simple ones they're really just bowls, and they've been turned not with a modern. I don't know the vocabulary for this in English, but they didn't use the modern form of a turntable that you would use for carving wood. They had something
like
older.
a lathe.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
yeah.
They didn't have that. They had something that's called svarve, which was more primitive, but it did the same thing. But if you look at the more complicated ones, you have ones that are carved like birds. And then there's complicated cross hatchwork on the chest of the bird. You've got the feathers, you've got the head, you've even got the thing on the top, whatever it's called, the crest. And there's ones that are carved with horse head handles, and they have really lovely cross hatching in the eyes, and so there were people who were very, very skilled at this, living in every village all over. It was actually for many people a side income. They would spend the winter making these and then fill up a backpack and go and sell them somewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
There's so much of this when you start to get into it. It's just crazy.
So do we know much from, bring it back to the beer again, because we've gone off a little bit there.
Yeah.
Do we know much about the kind of strains of yeast they were using?
As far as as far as direct evidence goes, there's absolutely nothing, like nothing whatsoever. What we do know is that they had words for yeast. They were perfectly well aware that yeast existed, and they were deliberately adding it to the beer. So that means that they must have known how to keep it from beer to beer. But if you look at the modern period, the equipment that people were using, to keep the yeast in between brews was like a piece of cloth, a ring of straw, just take a trunk of a tree that's about this thick, chop it off like that, put on the handle, and there's your yeast keeping equipment. That's all you need. You need some knowledge of how to do it, but it's just a few simple rules of thumb, and you're good. So we know that they had yeast that was. We also know from in other ways that it must have been domesticated. But what was it? We don't really know. We know that Norwegian traditional brewers today have a yeast that is unique to them, that they haven't been maintaining since forever. But is it the same that they had in the Viking Age? Probably, but there's no direct evidence.
I guess going back, you would have had to have somehow caught the yeasts to begin with, wouldn't you? So a lot like making sourdough bread, where you have flour and water and you get natural yeast that occur. So at some point, someone must have done that and found one that worked and just kept going.
Yes, absolutely.
Kept that one alive.
So it's thought that originally you just made the unfermented beer, and it fermented spontaneously because yeast is everywhere. And you can do that now. It will work. Well, it will ferment and become alcoholic. It may taste absolutely horrible, but at least
I've done it with apples. I've made cider that way,
which seems to work better. But then you have the yeast is sitting on the apple already.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's easier in a way. But it seems that eventually what they figured out was if you have a good beer and you don't clean the
Mm.
fermenter, the next beer is also likely to be good. And they kept doing that. So there are actually people in the world today who maintain their yeast in that way in South
Mm.
America. Um, and then eventually they figured out that, oh, it's not the fermenter, it's the sludge at the bottom. And if you just keep some of that, it'll work. But
Which,
what we see is that there's been extensive work done on the genetics of yeast and how different types of yeast are related to each other. And what you
mm.
can see is that once people got hold of a type of yeast that they were happy with, they really hung on to it and they shared it with other people and it spread. So most modern beer yeast belongs to a family that's called beer one. And the sort of the oldest, it looks like they are the oldest yeasts in that family are from
Mm.
Belgium and Germany. But there is a side branch from the UK, looks exactly like these yeasts at some point crossed the channel and then started developing and spreading in the UK. And then there is another branch in the US,
Mm.
as if, it crossed the Atlantic and did the same thing again. And you can sort of see with the farmhouse yeast something similar in Norway. So like you said, once they found something they were happy with, they seem to have been able to hang on to it and share it
Mm.
with each other.
And I guess if you were then migrating to another country and you had one that worked, you probably took it with you because
Yes, very, very
you're going to
likely.
want to brew beer again.
Yes, exactly. And if you have a bit of a section of wood trunk with yeast on it, it's not difficult to bring. It's not large. It's not heavy, and the stuff is dried. It's going to keep for a good long while, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. We've actually got a local brewery, and years ago they had an issue with their yeast where someone killed it off.
Right,
And again, it was one of these traditional, they'd always brewed with it. And so
right.
they had to start again. And of course, the people in the pubs noticed because the flavor of the beer changed.
Yeah,
There's literally nothing they could do. Just someone had accidentally killed it off, and that was the end of.
yeah. This happens to traditional brewers as well, and
Mm.
this used also to be a problem for commercial breweries when they were maintaining yeast in the way that you say. Um, and usually the way that it would fail was that you were reusing the yeast and some
Mm.
bad organism would get in and bad flavors would develop when this grew, right? And then all
Mm.
of your yeast would be contaminated. So the only way out would be to just throw everything away and get new yeast from someone else. And the first time that someone found a way out of that was late 19th century. That's when the way the breweries are using yeast now effectively was invented and solved this problem. But it's not very long ago. It was 140 years.
That's fairly recent. Yeah.
Yeah. And people were stunned when it was discovered that like brewers in Norway, Lithuania, Russia, and Latvia are
Mm.
still maintaining their own yeasts. But when you realize that, yeah, but everyone did that until 140 years ago, it becomes it's just we who forgot how things used to be. It's not as remarkable as it seems,
Mm.
or as strange, I guess is a better word, because it is remarkable.
Yeah. But then, yeah, it's no different to the modern baker again, keeping that strain of you get a sourdough bread that works. You
Well, I,
stick
I
with
I
it.
would say there is a difference because in you when you can make a new sourdough starter anytime you want.
Mm.
You just need flour. That's all you need, and it will almost always work. But the reason that it works is that you don't really care very much what kind of yeast it is because you do very, very little fermentation in a bread. Whereas in a beer, the whole product is defined by fermentation. So minute differences in the
Mm.
yeast suddenly become super important. If you take a Hefeweizen yeast, a German wheat beer yeast, and you try to make an English bitter with it, it's not going to
Mm.
work. They're both from the beer one family, but your customers down the
Yeah.
pub are going to go, what is this? Did they put mashed bananas in the beer? What's going on? So the amount of CO2, that inflates a bread is just a little bit. But if you ferment a beer and when you think it's done, you put it in a barrel and you close the barrel, but you misjudged it and you put it in too early, you have a serious problem now.
Yeah.
Either the barrel is going to literally explode, or when you open it, you're going to be showered in beer for like 5 to 10 minutes before it calms down.
That's like
the amount of CO2 is just insane. You wouldn't believe it.
Yeah. No, some of my homebrews have I've gifted bottles to people before, and they've opened the cap and
Yes. Yep. But on the web, you can find a video made in a Lithuanian village in the 1960s. It's a wedding, and people are doing wedding things, and they're all happy. And after 20 minutes, suddenly there's this change, and there's this person who's talking into he's speaking Lithuanian, so there's no telling what he's saying. He's talking into the camera. He's really concerned, and there's violent banging noises in the background. And when I saw it, I was like, "There's some sort of violence, an attack, or something." And then he goes out of view, and you don't really know what you're seeing, but you work out, oh, there's a door and a window, and there's something white inside the building. And then shapes start emerging in this mist, and it turns out to be two people fighting a beer barrel. And the jet is so powerful that at one point, and this is when it started calming down, one guy is on his hands and feet, all fours on the floor, and the jet pushes him sideways. He slides sideways across the floor. And then one of them manages to get the bung in, and it's like, oh, peace and calm descends, and everyone's happy, and they're wringing out their jackets and laughing. And but that gives you some idea of the and again, this is like the last few % of the fermentation.
I'm gonna have to look that video up now. I need to see this.
I'll try to remember to send you the link, and if I don't, just remind me, and I'll get it for you. I have it.
Yeah. So do we know much about the strength of beer back then? Because you're talking about your different levels of fermentation. Do we know how strong the beers would have been brewed to?
I think we can be absolutely sure that it would have varied massively. And some beers were made deliberately so that you could drink a lot of them and not become drunk. And what people in later ages always did was they would make one beer, and you have the malts, and you're running liquid through them and washing the sugar out. At one point, there's so little sugar left in the malt that if you keep going, you're going to weaken the beer that you're making, and you don't want to do that. So then what they do is, well, they just keep running off, but they don't mix it with the stuff they already made. So you would get one strong beer and one weak beer from the same malt. This is what's called small beer. That's literally what small beer really is. But how strong was a strong beer? Well, ultimately it would depend on how rich you were, and also how skilled you were. So in 19th century Norway, and also 20th century, when you tasted somebody's beer, you were really judging the person as a person, because if you live on a small marginal farm, you have little grain and it's bad. And if you live on the best farm in the valley, you're going to have a lot of grain and it's going to be good, right? But this is I just described your status in society, right? Not just your grain. And then there's your skill as a maltster, your skill as a brewer. How generous are you? Are you going to put in a lot of water? Are you not? So when people taste this beer, it's like an instant judgment of really all of you. So to at least at that time, to serve a weak beer was shameful. I've had people tell me things like, well, on that farm, they always make this weak beer, and his dad was the same before him. They just wrote off 2 generations of this family in a couple of sentences.
Wow.
And very likely this will have been the same earlier, right? But people starved to death in the Viking Age. So this was, some people will have been forced to use bad grain and just a little of it, and that's what they had, right? And some people, like the slaves, they didn't have beer at all. So there will have been huge differences.
Because there's also the idea that people drank the small beer instead of water because it was safe to drink when the water wasn't.
Well, I mean, that was true, for example, in Denmark into the 1950s and 60s, literally. The Danish word for small beer was daily beer. It was what they drank all the time. But in Norway, that wasn't the tradition. It seems that the Norwegians didn't have enough grain per farm. Yeah. So they were when they brewed, they would make the strong beer, they would make the weak beer, and they would drink the weak beer with the food as long as it lasted. But that might be a month, and then you would be out of it. So you might have this, only in January perhaps. So what they drank in Norway as the normal drink against thirst was, you know what whey is?
Yeah.
It's byproduct of cheese making.
Yeah.
So you basically all the whey that you made, you would collect it in a big vat.
Yeah.
And it would just sour awfully. And then you would take some of that and mix it with water, and that was your drink.
Okay. I'm trying to envision what that might taste like.
I don't really know either.
Yeah.
I've had some things made by modern restaurants that were similar. That was surprisingly nice, much nicer than you would think. I should add that this was also a traditional drink in Scotland and Orkney into the 20th century. It's called blonde, which is actually
I've heard of that actually. Yeah.
That's the Norwegian word. Blonde in Norwegian means to mix. And of course, it's because you took the whey and you mixed it with water, right?
But it's only soured, so that's not fermented at all.
That's right.
Yeah. I might have to try that.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. But of course, it's not trivial to make. You've got to make a cheese first. And so if you're interested, I managed to find a recipe, not really a recipe, but something that explains some of the tricks that you should know when you make it. So it's just a few sentences. I can translate it and send it to you.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Have
an experiment with that. I'm always looking for ways to use up the whey as well, because when I'm doing courses, we always make cheese, and I was looking at brewnost not too long ago.
Yeah, but what you just said, I think is super interesting, because I know that modern dairies are in the same position. You're making cheese, and that's great, and then you've got all this whey, and you don't want to just waste it, right?
Yeah.
So this becomes an economic issue, right? And it will have been the same historically. And I would be very surprised if that wasn't part of the motivation for making this drink in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I've drank it straight from making cheese. Get it in the bowl. It's
right.
Warm, cheesy water is how I describe it.
So cold, sour, diluted cheesy water. How's that?
Yeah. Well, that's one to find out.
Yeah. That would be interesting if you do it. I'd be interested to hear about that.
Oh, definitely try it. I tried to make brewnost myself. So I ended up, I think it was this pot, and it was probably up to here with whey. And I boiled it for hours, and I ended up with tiny little dish with some brewnost in it.
Right, but I think the brewnost usually was made with cream as well.
I looked into that, and actually it depends where it's from. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. There's two versions.
You get into questions of definition. So there's this school of thought that says there was a specific woman who invented brewnost, and that she did it by adding cream and blah blah blah. And when I read that, I thought, well, it sounds like people were doing this without the cream originally or something.
Mm.
So that sounds like it's probably right, but I'm not enough of a cheese expert to say anything more.
No, I'm not. I'm not a cheese expert. Mainly make soft cheeses. I have made a few hard cheeses.
Right.
But yeah, I think at a time when they wouldn't have had many sweet foods, the Viking era,
Yeah.
to me it seems likely that, because if you've got your fire on anyway, and all you need to do is leave a pot of whey there for hours, it gives you a source of something sweet. So to me, it seems quite likely that they might have done that. But
yeah, if you had something like a soapstone kettle or something, because those would be the right size.
and there is a find of a pot that was burned and discarded, and it's been analysed, and it's got cheese in it, or burnt cheese.
Oh, interesting.
But being as making cheese is just heating milk, I don't see how you'd get burnt cheese. So I think that maybe it was more likely it was something like Brunost, because
Okay,
that's
so
boiling for so long.
So here's another interesting thing. You know that a lot of traditional, well, there's this debate in cheese making over whether it's okay not to boil the cheese, right? And then when you read about old cheese making, it turns out that a lot of these people were not boiling the cheese. And it's the same thing I was saying about farmhouse brewing, that a lot of them don't boil the beer, right? When I looked into this, I found that one defined region that was not boiling the cheese is the exact same region that's still not boiling the beer.
Huh.
And of course, once you think about it, it's, well, in the time when they didn't have metal kettles, how were they boiling this cheese? If you don't need to boil cheese to make it, in an era where boiling was really difficult, why would they be doing it? So probably all of the cheese originally was not boiled. But when did they start boiling it? I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, because I think you can, milk naturally turns to cheese, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
If you leave it out. So I guess that's the no boil method of making it. And you can do the same with yogurt as well.
Traditionally in Norway, when the farmers made sour cream, they had these containers that you put the cream into. You put them on a shelf just below the ceiling, and they soured. That was that. Of course, there would be a culture probably that was living in these wooden vessels, but still they weren't adding anything. It just happened by itself. Yeah.
So should we talk a little bit about your book? Because I think you've got a few books, haven't you?
But not a lot in English. So the only thing that's on the English speaking market is this book, which
is on my list of books to buy, I must say.
Yeah, thank you. But I should warn everyone listening that it was really written for people who know how to brew. So it assumes that you know how to brew and that you know what's normal in brewing. But it does go through, the world that these traditional farmers were living in, which technologically is not far removed from the Viking Age, really. How they were growing their grain, how they were turning it into malts, and then also the brewing processes. And of course, that's where you hit the issue of the kettles quite soon. And so the book goes into all of the weird things that they did to deal with not having kettles. Also deals with the herbs that were used, what we know about that. And I also wanted to show why beer was so important. So I tried to talk about what were the other drinks that were available. So there is a bit on the blonde, the weak beer, mead, and stuff like that as well. The other fermented drinks, I suppose I should say.
Yeah. Okay. I'm definitely going to check that one out. It's, as I say, it's on my list. I was going to pick it up this week, but I never got round to it in the end. So I'll pick it up soon and let you know what I think.
Yeah, it's not going away, so you can wait a couple of weeks. It'll be fine.
Was that is that self-published or is that for a publisher?
No. The publisher is actually the publishing arm of the American Brewers Association.
Oh, nice.
So, but that's also why the book assumes you know how to brew, right? Because that's their audience.
Yeah.
That's the people who buy this book. But it's 400 pages. It's quite detailed on what we know about all the different ways of brewing and the different types of beer and so on. And if I had to write it what's nice when you write for brewers in this situation is you can just say, so there are farmhouse brewers that don't boil the beer, and all modern brewers will go instantly, right? And you don't have to go through a huge spiel to explain why this is absolutely amazing. And the same with all the other weird things that they do. You don't have to first establish that this is very, very weird, and then So storytelling wise for me as the author, it made it a lot easier to write the book.
Yeah, there's an assumed knowledge behind it already. So
yes.
Yeah. So did you originally, when you started off, had you had any brewing experience? We never covered that, did we?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, not commercially. I brewed beers with some homebrewer friends, so I knew how it worked. And I also took a beer judging exam where you learn the different flavors. You learn how beer is, well, you don't learn how beer is brewed because they just assume you already know. But what you do learn is, okay, so if you taste green apples, that will probably mean that you made this mistake and it's this chemical. If you taste butter, that means you made this mistake and it's this chemical. So I wasn't an experienced brewer and I wasn't any expert on brewing, but I did know enough that when we started to talk to the traditional brewers, it's like, this is weird. This is really weird. What is this? So I suppose I was lucky. I think if I had really been an experienced brewer and deeply into that mindset, I would have met these brewers and just gone, this is crazy. I can't deal with this. But I knew enough to know it was remarkable, not so much that I rejected sort of their point of view. It was really lucky.
Yeah.
I was lucky in a way. But of course, also, I always tasted the beer, and that was that meant that whatever they were doing that was really weird, clearly they were doing something right because the beer was good. So it was always validated in a sense.
All right, so there's 6 questions that I tend to ask every guest, 3 of which will go out on the main podcast, and then 3 will be bonus ones for Patreon only. So what I'll do is I'll ask you the first 3, close the podcast, and then reopen it up for the Patreons.
Yep.
That sound all right?
Sounds fine.
Good. All right, so have you got a dream project? If you had an unlimited budget, what would you do with it?
Ooh. I guess I would start collecting all the brewing yeast around the world that's currently not being taken care of by anyone. So the work that I've done has been to collect yeast in Norway and the Baltics, and I think we've collected what we've been able to find. But in Chuvashia in Russia, they say that every family that has a living grandmother is still brewing, and most of them seem to have their own yeast. So that must be, and of course, if you think about it, there's also Africa where there is a lot of brewers. So a friend of mine, Martin Thibault, he went to Ethiopia and was able to sample some yeast, but there must be thousands of different brewing yeast. And then you have the same in South America. So, and in Asia, now that I think about it. Yes. So, and this is yeast that has adapted to brewing. So it's not wild yeast. It's really yeast that, is specialized for brewing. And probably a lot of this is going to go away.
I was going to ask you.
I mean, do that because it's worth saying. Yeah.
Yeah. It was just to kind of expand on that. So would that be for a preservation perspective of the yeast, or more to see whether they're all tied together? So whether, the same strains of yeast that are in America are also in Russia.
Right. It's definitely for the preservation. I mean, that would be worth it in itself.
Yeah.
But of course, you also want to study them and see what they are. So, and that has two sides. So the first is we know that the Norwegian traditional yeast, for example, is um, it can handle a lot more alcohol. It ferments faster. It can handle many more temperatures and tricks as well. So it's worth, studying it to see what they are, what the aromas are, not least. But yes, in a way that the yeast that they use in South America is not the same that they're using in Africa, because we can see differences in Norway just from the west coast to the eastern inland part of the country. And then in the Baltics, there seems to be at least two different groups. And then, so yeah, probably there is actually huge variety.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question that I ask everybody is, do you think you could survive on a Viking aged diet?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is that, if I was a chieftain or a warlord, I'm sure I could. I mean, from what the Rigstula poem says, these guys were eating wheat bread, and they had, fried birds, and they were drinking wine. I'm sure I could get by on that stuff. But statistically, the chances aren't great that I would be a chieftain, I don't think. And then if I think of, what did Norwegian peasants eat in the 19th century? Barley porridge, sour milk, barley porridge, sour milk, maybe some flatbread, maybe some fermented fish.
Yeah.
But so it sounds like it would be horrible or it would be difficult to make yourself eat that stuff, which I guess is sort of part of why you're asking this question. But I've heard about what happens to people who, come to the edge of starvation. In the end, you turn into a robot that will eat anything, even including stuff that isn't food. So I don't think you would starve to death, because you would eat. Your body would make you eat, even if you perhaps wouldn't want to. So, but people did starve to death back then. There was a particularly gruesome custom that was, if you were a slave and you bought your freedom, and then you couldn't feed your family, the law says that there is one thing that you can do. You can go to the, where people are buried, and dig a grave and put your whole family in it. And the last person to survive, your previous owner has to feed this person and take care of them. So I bet it is very extreme. But what I'm getting at is, even though I think your body would make you eat the food, it wouldn't take an enormous amount of bad luck for you to starve to death anyway. It certainly happened to people.
Yeah.
There's a cheery thought at the end there.
So I've got the last question sort of ties in with that one a bit. Is there any food or drink that you would miss?
Yeah. Well, I described 19th century peasant cuisine, right? So I would miss pretty much everything that I eat, except possibly cheese, I guess. Probably after a while, I would even miss stuff I don't like now. Yeah, well, I mean, everything, absolutely everything.
Yeah. It's a difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because, like you say, the food is so far removed from what they would have had.
Yeah.
I get a lot of answers tend to be things like caffeine and sugar.
Well, I gave up caffeine in February this year, or March, I guess it was. So that's not an issue anymore. I've done that.
So you're one step ahead of the rest of us.
Yes. Yeah, I'm better prepared for the Viking fast. Yeah.
All right, so we'll wrap up here, say goodbye to everyone, and then we'll record some bonus stuff for the Patreons. So thank you everyone for watching. Or quickly, actually, is there anywhere that people can follow you online? Are you on Instagram or Facebook? I think you've got a website, haven't you?
I have a blog, and I also have a Twitter account and a Facebook page. So I can be followed on all three of those places.
If you want to send me some links to those, what I'll do is when I put the video out, I'll pop a description underneath.
Sure.
Just so people can find you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, well, thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
If you enjoyed the podcast and want to hear more, remember to like and subscribe and give me a rating. For recipes and ideas, visit my website saxonforager.co.uk. I also have 3 cookbooks available to buy on Amazon worldwide. These are Eat Like a Viking Volumes 1 and 2 and Eat Like a Halfling. Thanks for watching!